Okay, welcome back. So in the last lesson, we looked at handling bad requests that is provided by the user or the client. What I want to do now is to look at restricting that input. So we want to make sure that the input that is actually provided by the user is valid. It meets some tests. So to illustrate this, let's try this. Let's take a very large JSON file, okay, maybe 60 megabytes, and see what happens. Whenever I'm specifying a file with curl, I need to use the @ symbol, okay, and this is the location of the file. Excuse me. It still gives me back a valid JSON response, right? What happens if I have a JSON, valid JSON request, and then after that I have other things, right? I still get back a valid JSON response, 200 OK. So let me go back here to loading the large file and see what we get. Okay, we get 200 OK, right? So it's not complaining about the file size. What about something like this, where I have 2 JSON requests? Okay, still gives me back a valid response, right? We only want one JSON response. We only want one JSON request, that is. And finally, what if I have something like this, where we include city, and city is not a valid field name. So if we go back to school, okay, there is no city here, right? What happens? We still get back 200 OK, all right? So this is a problem. We want to sort of notify the user about what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So let's stop my server and let's see what we can do to restrict the input. Okay, so let's go back to my read.json file. Okay, and so the first thing I want to do before I decode the request, I want to check the size of I want to set the size of the request. Okay, so I will use http that max bytes reader to limit the size of the request body to 1 megabyte, which is roughly 2 to the 20th power. Okay, so I'm going to say max bytes, and that will be 1,048,576. Okay, and so now I want to go ahead and decode the request. And what I need to do, I need to restrict the body. So I'm going to say that r.body assignment sign, Okay, I'm not going to use the shorthand notation because r.body already exists. I'm just reassigning to it. So I'm going to say http.maxbytesResponse. Notice it returns an IO reader close, right? And it simply limits how many bytes are to be read. So we need to provide it W. We need to provide it the IO read closer. R.body implements that. We also need to provide it how many bytes. Okay, and so it should be of type int64. So I'm going to use max bytes. And of course, it goes ahead and wraps it with int64. All right, great. So this is our body. Okay. And now let's go ahead and continue the decoding. So I'm going to have my new decoder being JSON dot max. Well, get ahead of myself there. JSON dot new decoder. Okay, so we're going to provide r dot body. Okay. So once we have that, then we can go ahead and what we can do, we can say that we will disallow unknown fields. So if the user or client provides an unknown field in the request, then that will notify us. Okay, so disallow unknown fields. Okay, so now we can go ahead and we can actually do the actual decoding. So error is equal to or is assigned to DEC dot decode, and I need to provide my DST. Okay, great. So that's what I need to do. I need to see what the max bytes are, and I need to go ahead and disallow unknown fields. And then once I've done that, I can proceed to do the actual decoding. All right, good. Okay, so let's come down here and let's see how we can incorporate these checks to ensure that we don't break any of these rules. Okay. All right. So let's look at the idea of a field that does not match up to anything in our struct. So the user provides a invalid field. So how do we handle that? Okay. Well, let's make some space. Okay. And let's look at that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to check for unmappable fields. Okay, fields that have no corresponding value in the struct, as I said earlier. So we're going to have a case. What I want to do, I want to use the strings package, and I want to check for the prefix. Okay, and so if the error that is returned has a prefix, okay, if it has a prefix, JSON colon unknown field. This is the specific error. So if I ever see this specific error, then I know that there is a field that does not have a corresponding value. So if I see this error, right, if the prefix, remember has prefix is just telling me if the error message has or begins with this. If it begins with that, then I will need to craft an error message. And so what would come next would be the field name. So I need to get that field name. So I'm going to get the field name by simply removing this portion. Okay, so field name is going to be strings that trim the prefix. Okay, and so I'm trimming the prefix from errors.error, well, error.error. And what exactly do I want to trim? Well, I want to trim this. Okay, so I want to trim this. Let me remove that space. Okay, great. So I want to remove JSON unknown field. And once I remove that, what I will be left with is the actual name of the field that is incorrect. And so I'm going to use that as my field name. All right. So for example, if it had JSON unknown field city, then I will end up with city being the field name because I have stripped all of this trim. All right, so now I can return my message. And my message will simply be body contains unknown key modulus s, and that key is actually field name. Okay, so let's deal with the file too large aspect. So, well, not file, but the request being too large. Okay, so that would be a case, and what I want to do, I want to check that the error message has actually the string http colon request body too large. Okay, too large. If that's the case, I know that the request is too large. So remember, if we check after running max bytes reader, if that that allows me to check to have a maximum size, and so when I decode and it violates that maximum size, then it will generate my error, and that will be HTTP request body too large. And so I can simply say I'm going to return error message fmt.errorf, and I'm going to simply say that the body must not be larger than modulus d bytes, which of course is max bytes. Okay, so that takes care of having a request being too large. Now, what happens if the user or the client provides two JSON requests, right, back to back? So how do we deal with that? Because we only want a single request, okay, for a single school in our case. All right, so to deal with that, we will simply decode again. Okay, so what I'm going to do, right? I will call decode again. Okay, so I call it once here, and if I call it again and it returns something, then I know that the user provided 2 JSON requests in the body, which is not right. We only want a single JSON response, that request. So that's easy enough. I'm going to simply say dc.decode, and I'm going to pass an empty struct. Okay. All right. And then I'm going to simply check to see if it's not empty. Okay. So if not equal to io.eof, remember, if nothing comes after, then it will be an io.eof. There's nothing else to process. However, if there is something to process, then we know that we have a problem and the user provided more than one. And so I'm going to simply return errors that new body must only contain a single value. Okay, so that is one thing we want to look at. All right, so there we go. Oh, okay. So let me get rid of that. Okay. All right, that's much better. Okay, so we put this outside of our if. Okay, so if we go through all these errors and there are none, then the last thing we need to do is to call the code again. Okay, just to make sure that only one request body was provided. Okay, let's save that and let's start our server again. Okay. Let me grab the first one. Okay, so in this case, right, we have city which doesn't exist. Right, and so we get a 400 body request. Body contains unknown key city. That's much better. Let's look at this one. We have 2, 1, and 2. Okay, there should only be 1. Body must only contain a single value. Okay, and I think I messed that up. It should only contain a single JSON value. That makes more sense. Okay, so a single JSON value. Okay. All right. And let's see if we can get this one. Okay. Body must only contain a single value, right? JSON value. All right. So we've got that. Everything seems to be working. Let's see if I can load a large file. Okay. All right. So it's telling me that error body must not be larger than 1 megabyte. Okay. So it is catching when we have a file or a body, a request that is too large. Okay. And so we have that right here, right? Where we are setting the maximum. Okay. Good. It's right here. All right. So that's how we restrict our user input so that we can get a better control of what is provided to our API. All right. Okay, so I think it's a good time to do a commit. So git add, git commit, added, able to added code to handle bad request and to restrict request, right? So we're restricting requests. All right, so let's get that. Okay, let me push this. Let's have origin, main, okay, so that brings us to the end. And so what we want to do next is to jump into how do we validate the actual input that is coming in from the JSON request. All right, so we're going to do validation. I'll see you in that next lesson.